And today, the fourth session, we're going to be creating an Azure Data Factory and using that to ingest data from an on-prem SQL Server database. So super excited to show you guys this. So before you get started, there is a few prerequisites, some of these being things that we've covered in previous sessions. So if you're not familiar, you're welcome to look at the YouTube playlist, youtube.com/TimeXtender. You can find a playlist called TimeXtender Tuesdays, and you'll find all the previous sessions recorded. But what you will need to have accomplished if you want to follow along today is you'll need access to the Azure portal with permissions to create resources. You'll need permission to enable an app registration on an ADF resource. So we need to provide usage rights or a role on the ADF resource. You also need a TimeXtender app server running with the ODX storage already configured. Another piece that you'll need here, and I'll mention this again later, but you will need to install the Java runtime environment on the data source server. So we're going to be using an on-prem data source SQL server where we're going to be loading data using an Azure Data Factory integration runtime. That integration runtime is going to be packaging files in a Parquet format. And in order to do that, you do need a Java runtime environment for that Parquet format packaging process. Excuse me. And then the last step is you will need a data source, of course, available to both TimeXtender and the Azure Data Factory. Now, this data source does need to be able to connect, or rather the app server, the ODX server needs to be able to connect to this data source as well as Azure Data Factory. And that's because TimeXtender needs to see the metadata that's available to pull all of that information out. Things like table filters, column filters, primary keys, incremental load, all depend on TimeXtender having an understanding of the metadata that's available in that data source. So that's why that's an important prerequisite here. Okay, so what are we going to be doing today? Today, we're going to be ingesting on-premise data from an on-premise location, a SQL Server database, loading that data up into Azure and storing that in an Azure data lake. Now, this is a fairly complex process that is made much simpler using Azure Data Factory and, of course, much faster as well. It's also much faster because of TimeXtender. So we already have TimeXtender, the ODX configured and working up there in our app server. And we're going to use ODX to generate an Azure Data Factory pipeline and load that data in. So the first thing, we need to create the ADF resource. We need to provide access so TimeXtender can talk to that resource. And then TimeXtender is going to generate a pipeline loading the data from on-prem. This is going to be done using a self-hosted integration runtime. Now, that self-hosted integration runtime is a part of the Azure Data Factory engine that gets installed on your on-premise server. And that allows Azure Data Factory to push the data, and that would be egress, right? So send the data out of your system rather than Azure Data Factory trying to reach into your system, which is ingress, and grab that data, right? And this allows for a much more secure connection because you're not having to open up all of your ports to the outside world, so data can be pulled in. Instead, it's pushed out using this self-hosted integration runtime. So again, self-hosted integration runtime is going to be pulling data from on-prem SQL Server, using the ODX to orchestrate and pushing that data out to, using Azure Data Factory, out to the Azure Data Lake. All right, so we do have a lot to get through today, so I'm going to be going at a decent pace, but let's go ahead and get started. The first step here is to create the Azure Data Factory resource. So I will go ahead and do that now. We'll start here in the Azure portal in my TX Tuesdays resource group, as we usually start. And we're going to start by clicking add. We're going to add a new resource into this resource group. And I'm just going to type in here data factory. Here we have data factory. Okay, I'm going to click create. I'm going to create that resource. So again, inside my subscription, inside my resource group, I want to select the same region that I've been using for my other resources. This is going to reduce some of the latency in that communication. I'm going to call this TX2's ADF. All right, version V2. That's the latest version of Data Factory. We're going to configure Git later. We don't need to use Git because TimeXtender, of course, handles that CI/CD multiple environment management internally. Next, we're going to go into networking. We don't need to adjust any settings here. The public endpoint is what I'm going to use. We do also, you can configure this with a private endpoint. However, I'm not going to be doing that in today's session. Advanced, we're going to skip that. We're going to skip any tags. We're going to go right to review and create. So let's get this resource created here. All right, this is going to take us just a couple seconds here, and that resource gets created here very quickly, and then we can go to that resource. Great, so here I have my Azure Data Factory resource inside my TX Tuesdays resource group. And the next step, of course, is to enable the app registration access to this ADF resource. Now, if you remember in a couple weeks ago, we also created something called an app registration. Now, this is something that's used to authenticate users to communicate with these different resources. So I'm going to use the same app registration that I created last time, and we're going to use that to authenticate to the Data Factory. You can create a new app registration and use a different app registration for this purpose. However, in this case, I'm going to be using the same app registration I already have. So I simply go to Access Control on the ADF resource, click Add, and add role assignment. I'm going to select a role. In this case, we need to use Data Factory Contributor. And here, I want to assign access to a user group or service principal. The app registration is also known as a service principal. And my app registration is called TX. And then I have that right there, TX Tuesdays. And I will click Save. And that's going to give that app registration, TX Tuesdays, Data Factory contributor rights to my Azure Data Factory. Now, the next step is to set up the self-hosted integration runtime. So I want to set up the self-hosted integration runtime. If you remember our little diagram here, I want to set this up on my on-premise SQL server and install that right there locally. Now, it doesn't have to be installed on the actual SQL Server machine instance. It can be installed on another app server as long as it's in the same on-premise location. You want to make sure it's within this this housing of the on-premise servers here. All right, so let me navigate to my server. I already have that server up and running. Here is my SQL Server. We can see this is actually called SQL Server here. And I have this available. We have my server up and running. I have some databases available that I'm going to connect to. I want to take this database, AdventureWorks 2014, and we want to load that database into the Azure Data Lake. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up my ADF. Okay, so I need to find my Data Factory name. I call this TX Tuesdays, no results found. I might need a refresh here. Give that just a second. Here we go. And it doesn't look like that's showing up. So let me go back and find the proper link for this. We're going to go to Overview. I'm going to copy this link here. And let's go back to my server. So what you want to do is you want to open up the Azure Data Factory inside of your source system, right? So this is my SQL Server. machine. I'm opening up my Azure Data Factory in there. And then you want to click on Manage, Integration Runtimes, and New. So I'm going to create a new integration runtime. This is a self-hosted integration runtime, so I'll select that option. Of course, self-hosted again. And I'll give that a name. I'm going to call this TX2's IR for integration runtime. Click Create. That's going to create my integration runtime in Azure. And then I need to install that on my server here. So I'm going to use the Express setup. You can download and install this a different way, but the Express setup is so very easy. So I'm just going to click this link. That downloads a little package for me. That is the configuration file. So this will download, install, and configure my self-hosted integration runtime on my data source server. Great. So while that's running, let's go ahead and go to our next step in the process, which is add an ADF data source to the ODX. Okay, so let's go to our app server where we've installed TimeXtender. We have the ODX server running. We even have our ODX storage tied to Azure Data Lake. And let's go ahead and add a data source. Click here, Add Data Source. This is going to start the wizard that's going to allow me to configure this data source, put in all the necessary settings. So I'm going to put in here, we'll call this SQL server. Great. And you can see in this list all of our 200 plus different providers that we have available inside of TimeXtender. The nice thing is the ODX does come with this. You have access to all of these different data sources. Plus, what many people don't know is also any provider that's installed on that source system. So if you install third-party providers on the server, they'll actually appear in this list here as well. What I'm going to do, however, is I'm going to start with this Azure Data Factory SQL Server source right here. Great. Now I need to plug in all the information. So we have the app ID and secret for the app registration. Let me go. I have all of these saved over on the side here. Get the app ID. And again, this is how TimeXtender is going to authenticate itself to Azure to ensure it has the proper permissions to control that Azure Data Factory. The Azure Data Factory folder name is optional. However, I do recommend it. It just keeps all of your different ADF pipelines organized in nice folders. I'm going to call this on load on-prem SQL. Okay. This is the name of the ADF resource. And just to verify quickly here, TX2's ADF is what we called it. Great. Plug that in. The resource group. All right, let me copy that. That's TX Tuesdays 1. Description ID. Okay. And then, of course, the tenant ID. Great. So I have all that information in. So this is how it connects to the Azure Data Factory. Now we need to put in the details to connect to that SQL Server data source. Okay. So first of all, let's put in the database. As we recall, it's AdventureWorks 2014. That's the name of the database. And then username and password for that SQL Server. Let me find that information here. We have here my username. In password. Great. So that's how I authenticate there. And next is the data source. So this is the actual server name for, or the instance name for that SQL Server. Now, as you recall, I have the server running, and you can see actually up here, if I can get rid of this window, can't see that. Anyways, I have the DNS name saved right here. And I can just copy that and paste that right into the box. So this is the server name or DNS name of that SQL Server instance. Now, it is very important here that you paste that instance name or the server name in both of these boxes. So we have the Azure SQL connection, execution connection, and then the Azure SQL synchronization connection. So this is how ADF connects to the data source. And then this is the server name that TimeXtender uses to connect to the data source. Now, there is a case, a scenario in which these could be two different servers. And so that's why we provide the different boxes. But in 99% of the scenarios, it's going to be the same server. And then we want to put the integration runtime name. So we did save that here. I believe I called that TX Tuesdays IR. So we have the integration runtime name. We can click test connection. Okay, great. So now we've plugged in all of our information for the ADF and the data source. What tables should we load? Well, I'm using ADF, so let's just go ahead and load all those tables. We do want to add a transfer task now. Okay, let's go ahead and add that transfer task. Great, I'm going to call this load in that data source, all tables again. And I'm not going to schedule this, but here you can add a quick schedule for your data source, putting in the start time and when you want it to recur. Let's go ahead and just click. Let's have this refresh every day of the week. Great. Finish that up. We also need a synchronization task. Sync is what I'm going to call it, and finish that up. So we can execute the sync. This will cause TimeXtender to reach out to that data source, again, directly, not through ADF, but directly, so it can pull the necessary metadata to be able to list all the tables that are available, rows, primary keys, things that are required for incremental load, all of these different pieces. So that completed successfully. Now I can click execute. This is going to, first of all, create the Azure Data Factory pipeline, and then start running that Azure Data Factory pipeline. So why don't we quickly review what we've gone over, and then we can monitor this load. So we've created the Azure Data Factory, we enabled app registration access, we set up the self-hosted integration runtime, we added the ADF data source to the ODX, and next we're going to monitor the load in ADF and the TimeXtender user portal. Okay, so let's quickly go over to that Azure Data Factory. We can click on Author and Monitor here. This is going to open up that Azure Data Factory that TimeXtender is communicating with. First of all, under Author, we can go to Pipelines, and we can see that folder name that I created. So Load On-Prem SQL is the folder name, and it generated this pipeline for us. So automatically generated this pipeline with a for each loop, and that's just using the copy table action within it. There are two data sets that you'll notice as well, the source and the destination. So the source being the SQL Server, the destination being the Azure Data Lake. Next, we can go to Monitor, and we can see that this load is in progress. So TimeXtender did generate, not only generated the pipeline, but is also executing that pipeline run. So in here, we can open that up, and we can see what's happening. So there's a nice Gantt chart view here. We can click on the Gantt chart, and we can see that it's actually loading quite a bit of data already successfully. These green areas are the different tables that it's completed. So it has completed the load for all of these different tables in here. We can refresh and see that updated quickly. Another place that we can monitor the load is in the user portal. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to the user portal. We'll sign in. And the nice thing about having the ODX repository in the cloud, for one, customers don't have to manage it. You don't have to manage it. TimeXtender manages that for you, but you also are able to see and monitor status of your different ODX loads. So I can go in here and see the data lake, see my different data sources that are running, and we can see here that I have a SQL Server data source, and the synchronization completed and only took a few seconds, and now the load is running, and we can see that that's running right now. The last thing that I do want to show you here, since we're all almost done, is the Azure Storage Explorer. So this is my TX Tuesdays container, right? So this is the TX Tuesdays data lake that I created. And now we're loading data into this container. I'm going to go ahead and hit refresh here. And let's see. So TimeXtender did create that SQL Server data source folder. And within that data source, we have all of the different tables here. You might be familiar with many of these from the AdventureWorks database. But we can see all of these available, and we can open up many of these and actually go in and see, okay, so TimeXtender is still doing some work in there. And we can see some of these data for these different tables being created. So it's still doing the load. So you'll see many of these aren't quite done yet, but we can probably go and see, yeah, so we have the data file here. It's created the Parquet file for us. So that's really nice. So our ADF is on-prem SQL Server and directly into the Parquet files in the data lake. All right, and that's it for our session today.